It is 4 a.m. in the year 900 AD, and the air in your lungs feels like shards of glass. You are not in a bed. You are on a raised wooden platform, covered in damp sheepskins, fully clothed, in complete darkness. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to embers that produce more smoke than heat. The smoke has nowhere to go. There is no chimney, only a small hole in the turf roof, so it hangs at chest height like a permanent indoor fog. The first thing you hear is not the wind, it is the slow, wet breathing of a cow 6 feet from your head.
This is not unusual. This is your house. For the next 5 months, this windowless, turf-walled structure, 60 feet long, shared with 20 other people and a dozen head of livestock, is the entire boundary of your survivable world. Beyond its walls, the temperature will regularly drop to -20 degrees Celsius. The sun will rise for 4 hours and set again, and the sea will freeze in the fjords. You are a Norse farmer in Scandinavia in 900 AD, and you need to get from October to April alive. Most modern people would not make it to February.
The most obvious question about Viking winter survival is also the most misunderstood one. How do you heat a 60-foot longhouse when the temperature outside is -20 degrees Celsius? The answer is not a big fire. A central hearth in a Viking longhouse was a survival tool, but a mediocre heater. Most of the warmth escaped through the smoke hole in the roof. Build the fire too large and you risked burning the thatch and killing everyone inside. Build it too small and frost crept across the floor and froze boots to the ground by morning.
But the real heating system was at the far end of the hall. In the Viking world, your house was also your barn. One half of the longhouse was living space. The other half was the byre, the animal quarters. This was not a failure of planning or a sign of cultural primitivism. It was precision engineering. A single cow produces approximately the equivalent of a 1 kilowatt space heater in continuous body heat. A longhouse with 10 cattle was a 10 kilowatt heating system that required no fuel, produced no carbon monoxide, and never went out. The heat from their bodies, their breath, and the slow fermentation of their waste created a low-grade thermal blanket that radiated through the entire structure. On the coldest nights, the temperature differential between inside and outside a well-managed longhouse could exceed 30 degrees Celsius.
This created what could be called a hierarchy of warmth. The thralls, the slaves at the bottom of Norse social order, slept nearest the animals, where the heat was greatest and the smell was worst. The landholder and his family slept at the far end, near the hearth, relying on fire and furs rather than cattle heat. Social status in a Viking longhouse was measured partly by how far you could afford to be from the cows. The smell was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The air was thick with ammonia from urine, methane from manure, and the accumulated smell of unwashed bodies and wet wool. But in 900 AD, the stench of a byre was the smell of not freezing to death. The Norse made this trade every single winter without hesitation. Without those cattle, the Viking Age would have ended in the first frost.
The second survival problem was clothing. Modern cold weather survival doctrine has one absolute rule: never stay wet. Moisture pulls heat from the body 25 times faster than still air. A wet person in cold conditions dies of hypothermia at temperatures that a dry person survives comfortably. For a Norse farmer, this rule was impossible to follow. For a Norse sailor, it was a fantasy. Sea spray, sleet, freezing rain, and constant condensation meant clothing was perpetually damp for months at a time. In cotton or linen, the fabrics of warmer European civilizations, a Norse sailor on the North Atlantic would have been dead from hypothermia before clearing the fjords.
The Vikings had wool, but not the wool familiar to modern people. Viking textile production used a specific preparation process that deliberately preserved the lanolin, the natural grease that sheep produce to waterproof their own fleece. Modern wool processing removes lanolin because it produces an unpleasant smell and a coarse texture. Viking wool was coarse, heavy, oily, and smelled like wet dog. It was also one of the most effective cold-weather textiles ever produced. Wool is one of the only natural fibers that continues to insulate when saturated with water. The hollow structure of each wool fiber traps pockets of air even when wet, and those air pockets remain warm against the skin. The lanolin coating repelled the worst of the sea spray before it could penetrate fully. A Norse sailor wearing a vavmál cloak, the standard heavy woolen outer garment, was wearing a crude but highly effective wetsuit that allowed them to remain functional in conditions that would kill a person in modern cotton outdoor clothing within hours. This is not a minor technical advantage. It is the reason Norse exploration of the North Atlantic was possible at all. The wool was the technology that made the ships viable. Keeping warm requires heat. Heat requires fuel. Fuel requires food. And food in a Norse winter was the point where the survival system came closest to failing. Forget the image of Vikings feasting on roasted meat from sagas and films. For the majority of the Norse population, winter diet was a careful management of stored resources against a fixed and unforgiving deadline. The primary caloric source through winter was preserved protein. Salted fish, dried and smoked meat, fermented dairy in the form of skaya. These were shelf-stable, calorie-dense, and critical. But they had a significant nutritional gap. They contained almost no vitamin C. Fresh vegetables and fruits were available only during a short summer season. By October, they were gone. By December, the body's stored vitamin C was depleting. By February, a significant proportion of the Norse population was experiencing the early symptoms of scurvy: bleeding gums, joint pain, extreme fatigue, wounds that refused to heal, skin that bruised from minor contact. They had no name for this condition and no understanding of its cause. They knew only that every winter, by late February, everyone felt as though they were dying. The caloric situation was equally precarious. Historical and archaeological evidence identifies a specific period called the Hungry Gap, the 6 to 8 weeks in late winter when the previous autumn's stored food ran out before the new season's food became available. This was not an occasional failure of planning, it was a structural feature of the Norse agricultural calendar. Every year, for at least 6 weeks, the food simply ran low. To supplement the solid food supply, the Norse produced a thick, unfiltered ale that functioned more as fermented liquid grain than as a beverage. Packed with yeast, B vitamins, and complex carbohydrates, it was calorie-dense, shelf-stable, and critically, safe to drink. In a longhouse shared with cattle, fresh water sources were chronically contaminated with animal waste. The fermentation process in ale production killed the worst of the pathogens that the water supply carried. If the longhouse was difficult, the longship was something close to impossible. Imagine 30 men on a 30-meter open boat with no deck, no shelter, and no fire, exposed to the North Atlantic 24 hours a day for 3 weeks at a time. The same sea spray that saturated clothing within minutes, temperatures that routinely fell below freezing at night, waves that regularly broke over the gunwales. The mechanism that made this survivable was collective body heat managed as a deliberate system. The crew was divided into 2 watches. While one half worked, the other half retreated into communal sleeping arrangements called hudfat, sleeping skins made from seal skin or bear skin. 3 or 4 men pressed together inside a single enclosure, using combined body heat to maintain an internal temperature above the threshold of hypothermia. They were, in physical terms, functioning as a single thermal organism.
There is one threat to winter survival that the physical preparations, the turf walls, the cattle, the wool, the preserved food, could not fully address: the darkness. At the latitudes where most Norse settlements existed, midwinter produced as few as 4 hours of usable daylight. For 20 hours of every day, the world was dark. Not the partial darkness of a modern urban environment with its ambient light and artificial illumination. Absolute darkness, broken only by the firelight inside the longhouse and the occasional clear night sky outside. The psychological effects of sustained darkness at this intensity were severe and well documented in the Norse historical record. Multiple sagas contain specific references to men becoming unpredictable, violent, or catatonic during the depths of winter in ways that resolved when the light returned. The Old Norse term vetrinator, winter nights, referred not just to a season, but to a psychological threshold that the community understood and feared. What the Norse were experiencing is now identified as severe seasonal affective disorder, a clinically significant depressive episode triggered by the absence of light and its effect on serotonin and melatonin regulation. In a modern context, it is treated with light therapy, medication, and structured activity. In a Norse longhouse in 900 AD, it was managed through communal ritual, storytelling, the structured work of winter craft production, and the understanding, passed down through generations, that the darkness would eventually end. This management strategy worked well enough to sustain functional communities through the winter. It did not prevent the darkness from being one of the most consistently feared elements of the Norse year. The midwinter festival of Yule, from which the modern Christmas season derives much of its structure, was specifically designed to mark the turning point at which days began lengthening again. It was not primarily a celebration, it was a collective exhale.
A modern person transported into a Norse longhouse in midwinter 900 AD would face 3 distinct survival threats in order of how quickly they would become lethal. Carbon monoxide poisoning within the first week. Without an understanding of ventilation management, the precise balance of fire size, smoke hole positioning, and door usage that the Norse learned over generations, an inexperienced person managing the hearth would build the fire for maximum warmth and inadvertently bring the carbon monoxide concentration inside the longhouse to fatal levels. This is not a theoretical risk, it is the most common cause of death in enclosed wood fire environments, and it kills without warning. Vitamin C deficiency by week 6. A modern diet contains fresh vegetables, citrus, and fortified foods that provide continuous vitamin C. Remove those, and the stored reserves deplete within 4 to 6 weeks. The early symptoms, bleeding gums, fatigue, joint pain, are uncomfortable but not immediately fatal. The later symptoms, hemorrhaging, neurological damage, cardiovascular failure, are. Without knowing what scurvy was or how to prevent it, a modern person would have no defense against it.
Psychological failure at any point. 4 hours of daylight, smoke-filled darkness for 20 hours. No entertainment beyond what the community generated. No privacy, no ability to leave, no certainty that the food would last. Modern people have no baseline experience of sustained sensory deprivation and social confinement at this intensity. The psychological deterioration would not be dramatic, it would be gradual. Reduced motivation, impaired decision-making, increasing inability to perform the constant maintenance tasks that keeping the longhouse functional required. The tasks would be missed, the fire would be mismanaged, the food would be rationed incorrectly. The margin for error in a Norse winter was narrow enough that psychological degradation alone was sufficient to be fatal.
The Norse survived all of this, not because they were physically different from modern people. They were not. But because they had inherited several hundred years of accumulated knowledge about exactly how thin the margin was and exactly what maintaining it required. That knowledge was encoded in daily practice and in the community structures that kept people functional when individuals began to fail. It took generations to build that knowledge. The Vikings are remembered for the raids, for the longships crossing the Atlantic, for the axes and the helmets and the warriors. History kept those stories because they were dramatic, because they happened in other people's countries and left marks in other people's records. What history forgot was the other story, the one that happened every year, in every longhouse, across every fjord and valley from Norway to Iceland. The story of ordinary people doing something that, examined clearly and honestly, was genuinely extraordinary.
Getting from October to April alive every year, generation after generation, across centuries, in conditions that would incapacitate most modern people within weeks. They did it in darkness and smoke. They did it hungry. They did it with lungs damaged by the fire that kept them warm. They did it without knowing why some winters killed more people than others, without understanding the biochemistry, without any concept of what carbon monoxide was doing to their blood. They did it because they had no alternative, and because the people who came before them had learned through centuries of dying and trying again exactly what survival required. That is not a dark age. That is one of the longest and least celebrated survival achievements in human history.